well, these events have become something of a, I wouldn't say a habit, but they have become a fairly regular occurrence that people across the United States, people across the world, and especially people in Washington, D.C., have come to depend on to find some, at least something that looks like a clear path through the crisis that we face right now. And certainly the events over the last week have put us in a situation of such a degree of uncertainty on so many different fronts that the desire for a clear path is, I think, at an all-time high. The question is whether once that path has been defined, people are prepared to take it. There is nobody on the planet at this point who is more capable of leading people along that path, provided that they are willing to take it, than Lyndon LaRouche. And therefore, without any further delay, I bring you Lyndon LaRouche.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is going to be, while usual in some sense, is totally unusual because the situation is totally unusual. We have entered into a situation internationally, but especially in the United States, in which none of the people who are in leading positions in government have either the will or the perspective to deal with the problem. Everybody who is considered a leading person in government that I know of, and I've been scraping the ceilings for finding out who might have the temperament to take this on. There is no one in charge now in the Democratic Party or in the federal government which is capable and ready to make decisions which must be made now, which cannot be postponed. The overall situation is that the world system, starting with the United States, the world economic system is about to go into a general collapse. This is not something gradually, it's something that can happen in a short period of time, as a matter of days or even hours. The triggers can be triggered and you will have a breakdown which will be irreversible for this planet for generations to come. We're at that point. We're at a point of an implosion of the entire international monetary financial system. And it's now. And it will not wait until after the November election. You want to wait until after the November election to see how it works out. If you're worried about trying to keep the Democratic Party together through the election, you are off base. You are not facing reality. This is a situation in which the conventional politician who thinks he's experienced from the living generation, you know, I'm 88, so I come from a slightly earlier generation, actually. There are some people who are also 88 and who are not functioning too well anymore. I'm functioning. And therefore, I'll have to stand in and take responsibility for my generation, which is also the generation, in one sense, of Eisenhower and MacArthur. Because we're in that kind of situation globally where names like that, and also Franklin Roosevelt, are relevant. You have to understand, among all other things, that my generation, I'm sort of on the young side of my generation. Most of the people in my generation are dead. And the generation which has succeeded my generation, those who were born usually about 1945 or a decade later, who have gone through experiences where they have no understanding whatsoever and no capacity to react to, on their own, to react to the situation which confronts us now. You have to recognize this. You have to go back in history. There was a point when Franklin Roosevelt died. And already there's a very severe crisis because as of about the time of the successful breakthrough in Normandy, the British, who had been begging up to that time, double-crossing Roosevelt, but begging for his help from the United States to save their butt. It was the British system, including Winston Churchill, who had been responsible for bringing Hitler into power in Europe, suddenly found in 1941, they found in 1940 that Hitler had made a deal with a fascist French government, later typified by Pétain's leadership and Laval's leadership in the northern part of France, who were fascist. Laval was a fascist. Pétain was a fascist. They cut a deal with the Nazis under which a French force, which if mobilized with its allies, would have defeated a Wehrmacht onslaught against France. But that was not the case. The French organization and the British organization were chaotically organized. They were confident that they had a deal under which Hitler would be forced to go into a war against the Soviet Union directly. They counted on it. Their plan was to sit and let Germany and the Soviet Union destroy one another. That was their plan. Suddenly a change occurred. The Wehrmacht found it had an open door. All the cooperation it needed from the opposing command. Capable and patriotic commanders in the French forces and in government were pulled back or put in the rear where they could not command the troops. The preparations for defense of France against a Wehrmacht attack were non-existent. So then, when this worked itself out, Churchill screamed for help from Franklin Roosevelt. And so from that point on, with Churchill's usual double-crossing and scheming, from that point on until the breakthrough in Normandy, the British relied upon the United States to get their goose out of the oven. But shortly after that, the British, who had the inside track on the German peace negotiations, managed to tip off Hitler and company exactly as to what was intended, to negotiate an immediate peace. So what happened, these generals who were going to negotiate the peace, the surrender, from peace negotiations, were killed by the Gestapo and others. Hitler remained in power for another year, and Germany was virtually destroyed. And in the meantime, what happened in the United States, we had a fascist called Truman, who was a senator and part of the Wall Street crowd, which is the same thing as the British. And Roosevelt was, because of the conspiracy, was obliged to accept Truman as the vice president as a way of avoiding chaos in the U.S. command. A British trick. And Truman was a Wall Street asset, which means he was a British asset. And thus, when Roosevelt died, after a protracted war, on the death of Roosevelt and the conclusion of that war, Churchill and company had already, before the end of the war, with the collaboration of Truman, had set into motion a complete reversal of the intention of the United States for the post-war peace. And Churchill, together with Bertrand Russell, that swine, who was known for his ownership of Soviet heads of state, such as Khrushchev, who was a British agent of Bertrand Russell, Gorbachev, a British agent, Andropov, a British agent. And so the death of Stalin meant that a British agent, Khrushchev, took power. Now we, in my generation, generally tended to understand this problem. And we had two military leaders who were very important in this understanding, but also the leadership of the real patriotic side of OSS, were no longer OSS, Office of Strategic Standards, but they still existed. And this comes to me. Now, I was not a part of this crew during my military service, during the war, last war, well, the last real war, the last honest war. But I represented the same point of view. And that was steeled for me because of my experience in Calcutta during the terminal period of my military service overseas, in which I was directly engaged in with Indians and others on the prospect of what the United States should do with India and India's intended independence. And I sat on top of a British operation which conducted a slaughter in Calcutta, where I was, a slaughter directed against people in India who I had met as various political parties in Calcutta at that time. And so I came back out of service to the United States knowing that we had put a pig in the presidency called Truman. And the British had taken over and we were betrayed by Truman. Now, people who had been in the leadership of OSS, like Donovan, people associated with him, and people like MacArthur, and people like Eisenhower, who I had a short exchange with by correspondence in 1947. These people were patriots. And given the fact that we had a president who was not a patriot, Truman, but a British agent against American interests, a Wall Street type of the type we're dealing with today, probably a little more intelligent than today's, a little less stupid, a little less greasy. All right, we had that. So the time came when, in approaching the 1971 collapse, which I understood, and I was forecasting that collapse at that time as an economist, I began to move. And after several years of my movement in the 1970s, some people who were associated with the patriotic military and intelligence institutions of the United States from the World War II period, including people who had died by that time, Eisenhower and MacArthur. And over this period of time, since the death of Roosevelt, people like the circles of Donovan, the patriotic side, the circles of Eisenhower, the circles of MacArthur, had maintained an intention for the United States and against what was known to be the British enemy of the United States and its Wall Street scum who were the traitors to the United States and always had been. Now this scum, with its puppet, a crazy, stupid, degenerate, our current president, has brought us to the point, under British direction, where the British Empire, which is represented by especially not only the Queen, but represented by the financial institutions associated with Lord Jacob Rothschild's Inter Alpha Group, founded in 1971 as a part of the operation to shut down the Bretton Woods system that same year and to go on to the destruction of the United States. We have been destroyed. We have been betrayed. We have a guy who's a traitor if he's got the brains to know that he is, the President of the United States. We have reached a point of breakdown at which at any time now, we've reached a point of actual breakdown. We can have a sudden collapse of the United States economy at any point, and it will be a worldwide chain reaction collapse. Right now, And right now, there is none of the established leadership, political leadership of this government, which is alert and reacting and ready to defend the United States against the great menace which immediately faces it and its people. Under these circumstances, on the basis of the fact that I was, in a sense, drawn into support by these veterans of World War II, including the veterans of the leadership of Eisenhower and MacArthur and the Donovan circles, I ran, as many of you know, I ran an operation which became known as the SDI. This was my creation. I designed it. I designed it, of course, with people who I consulted, with whom worked with me. I had cooperation with leading military officers, veterans in France, general officers and similar people. I had cooperation with general officers and similar people from the German establishment, from the Italian establishment, from the Argentinian establishment, and so forth. So I ran an operation that was called SDI. And we secured, through the National Security Council's cooperation and my cooperation with them, we secured an SDI proposal, which would, if adopted, would have solved this problem of the United States. But the usual people, usually dumb politicians, not necessarily traitors, but dumb politicians, sabotaged it. And a British agent, Andropov, on the Soviet side, sabotaged it. And also a guy who's still alive today, a British-owned scum called Gorbachev, also sabotaged it and demanded my assassination. So they decided to imprison me rather than to assassinate me, which George Bush went along with. So now I stand here. I know what the problem is. I have a feeling for it because I come from a generation that's capable of knowing what the feeling for this kind of decision is. And I have the experience in large-scale operations, such as the SDI, which was a very large operation, knowing how to do these things and how to pull these things off. We have a class of politicians which, while some of them are very charming, some of them are very nice, some of them are very intelligent in their own ways, lack the ability to command forces for this kind of problem. Now, there are solutions, and that's the title of what I shall present today, and then we shall have some questions about these matters coming in from questions already posted, and new ones will be coming in on this subject, on the subject of the new economy. The remedy for this situation is the immediate action to get this president out of his office and into safe retirement where he doesn't kill himself. Because this president has a profile of the Nero and Hitler, who both, in coming to the end of their career, killed themselves. He's of that type. So my concern has been that he not kill himself, but he goes to a safe place where he is not allowed to kill himself. But we have to have a new presidency. The vice president would be perfectly acceptable for this purpose because he's a normal human being, not a lunatic. He may not be too accurate in all his estimates. He may not always say things right, but nonetheless, he's human and he's reasonable. And under crisis conditions, a man like that can be a useful figure if he's determined to serve his country as president. If he's determined to serve the interests of our nation and civilization, he can probably be trusted. And we have other people in government, federal government, who be trusted. Just get rid of this Obama plague. But it has to happen. Now, the simple way to do that, which is what people lack the guts to do, and it should be done this week. It should be done over the weekend. People who are patriots and intelligent at the same time will do it. And that is to push through immediately Glass-Steagall. Now, Glass-Steagall is only the beginning of the process. Glass-Steagall means that this president is no longer a factor. He's going out. He's not running the country. He's a failure. Nobody wants him, really. Politicians don't want him. Democrats don't want him. Republicans don't, of course, don't want him. They think it's be an advantage to them to do it or something. And I don't know what's going with the funny characters out there who neither Democrats nor Republicans. That's they're going in various directions. So we have to. The key here is this: we are being destroyed again by orders from London. Now, London does not represent the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is an appendage of this process, but not the author of it. The power lies with the British monarchy, the British Empire. The British Empire is not just its territorial powers. The British Empire is an international monetary financial cabal, which today is represented by a group called the Inter-Alpha Group. The Inter-Alpha Group formed in 1971 at the same time that the United States took down the Bretton Woods system. And this was a replacement for the Bretton Woods system. It was part of the effect of the destruction of the United States by the war which was launched to aid of the killing of Kennedy. Because President Kennedy was committed, together with Eisenhower and MacArthur, to prevent any long wars by the United States in Asia. And the only way that this war was set into motion, a 10-year-long war that ruined the United States, the so-called Indochina War, the only way that was done was by killing Kennedy. And the assassination of Kennedy and the cover-up of the assassination was what demoralized and terrified President Johnson and led us into 10 years of war which effectively destroyed the United States economy and which set into motion these horrors since. And it's to be remembered that in the 1960s, 1950s and 1960s, while they were still alive, circled, and still later for some other people who had been part of the OSS military assassin group, which had fought leadership in World War II, resisted this. They were neutralized by a group of Wall Street-related London direction. And the intent since that time, but actually since 1782, has been by the British Empire to destroy the United States. And the British Empire is not an empire of the British people. It's not an empire of the people of the United Kingdom. It's the empire of an international financier force, monetary financier force, which rules the world through a money system which it controls. This was a system which Franklin Roosevelt worked to destroy from the beginning of his presidency. To destroy by use of no other weapon but then the Constitution itself of the United States, beginning with Glass-Steagall. And so this group understood, and I have understood. And while most of them are dead, I'm still alive. And because I come from a generation which was involved in war, in Asia in particular, during the World War II, before Truman took over, and because I knew that Truman was a disaster for us on the day that Roosevelt died, as I said to the troops who asked me about this thing, I'm standing here saying, I know what has to be done. And I know that there's no alternative that's worth a damn at this time. All right, so I'll indicate what the measures are that I've laid out for moving this nation into a form of action which can succeed and will cure this problem and eliminate the effectiveness of our enemy. Whereas the problem is our politicians. Well, let me just add one thing on this qualifying so everybody can understand this. what happened is, you can imagine, here's the United States, which had been pulled out of the gutter in which had been thrown by Teddy Roosevelt, by Woodrow Wilson, by Coolidge, by Hoover. We were destroyed and betrayed. But suddenly, in the midst of a dark moment, Franklin Roosevelt had succeeded in overcoming the fascists inside the Democratic Party and taking over the nomination for the presidency and becoming president. And he knew what he was doing. He did it step by step, and he moved quickly. And he accomplished great things. You can imagine then my generation with that experience after having this trash, Teddy Roosevelt, treasonous trash. His uncle was a leader of the Confederate Intelligence Service operating from London. And a real pig. Woodrow Wilson, a family that was part of the organization of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was Woodrow Wilson that organized the Ku Klux Klan again on a larger scale than ever before while he was president, and did it from the White House itself. What a pig he was. Coolidge, pig. Hoover, opportunist agent. And we were being destroyed. And Roosevelt moved in and took immediate action to rescue the United States from a situation which is to be compared with what's happening under this president. This president is a disaster. Look at the suffering he's caused. I mean, George W. Bush was no damn good, but this one is far worse. This has been our greatest affliction. No enemy from outside our borders could have done the damage to the United States that this swine has done. And yet our cowardly politicians don't do anything about it. Why not? Well, that's because of what happened at the end of the war. What happened to my generation and the older generation that was just being born at that time, who were put through this right-wing terror, economic terror, deployed against the United States by the great affectionate relationship among J. Edgar Hoover, Roy Cohn, and Cardinal Spellman. Three people who were very closely associated, intimately associated with one another. And they typify this combination of forces which terrified the people of the United States who had come out of the Roosevelt generation, so to speak, out of a Roosevelt generation which had saved us, mobilized us, again as a great nation, and they were terrified into submission. And therefore the children who were born after the death of Roosevelt tended to be more easily corrupted because they were subjected to a terror conducted by their own government against them in behalf of the British Empire. So that generation, we call the baby boomer generation, born under these conditions, does not have much of a temperament for fighting against fascism as represented by Wall Street in London, for fighting against treason from the friends of Wall Street in London. They don't have the kind of stuff in them that my generation had. And it's not their fault entirely. Of course not. They were subjected to it from childhood, almost from infancy. So now we're situated where the enemy is laughing at us. No longer have leadership from my generation. I'm the last specimen in some sense of this, still actively standing on my feet and fighting and doing these things. So I have to speak. I'll speak for the conscience of the United States. I'll speak for the people who died serving the United States in my generation and earlier. The time has come to bring this to an end and to turn the corner now. People have schemes. schemes for the Democratic Party. Forget it. Learn the lesson from Franklin Roosevelt. Anybody who leads this nation to victory from among the ranks of Democrats is going to take over the Democratic Party. You don't have to coddle them. You don't have to stroke them. You don't have to make deals with them. Take over the leadership, save the nation, and you've got the Democratic Party. Even these prostitutes who are unwilling to do anything today about this thing, they'll sit there and say, yes, it's right, you're right. They won't do anything. They say, we've got to get our leadership together. We've got to get good Democrats all together so we don't lose this next election. Next election, buddy, if we don't do what we have to do now, there's not going to be a next election. At least not one you want to remember. The Democratic Party is finished if we don't do something now. And anybody who thinks they're going to hold the Democratic Party together under these conditions has to be some kind of an idiot, or else born too late. Not born in my generation. It has to be done. All right, now the first thing that has to be done, and has to be done this week, this weekend, next week, no later. Nobody should go home from Congress. Only people who are not patriots will leave the Congress now, will leave Washington now. If they're patriots, they're going to stay here in Washington. They're not going to leave until the job is done. And it's the ones that stay and do the job that will be the ruling Democrats in the coming period. It's the Democrats that do that will get a majority easily in the Congress. Not because they're good, but because the Republicans are so bad. That's the way it'll work. You want to win for the Democratic Party? Don't do what the Democratic Party tells you. They give themselves bad advice. If you want to be friends with them, don't honor their advice. We have to do this now. Without Glass-Steagall being enacted in the immediate period. Now, I don't care about anything else. And nobody else who's a patriot, who's capable, does care either. The hell with it. We have to save this nation, and we're on the verge of losing it. And those who are trying to compromise for the sake of the Democratic Party are making a double mistake. First of all, the Democratic Party is not going to win anything by your trying to cater to them. What you have to do is take them into the woodshed and give them a lesson from which they will graduate with honors. That's the way to do it. The possibility is not to the parties. That's European nonsense. That's European parliamentarianism. That's nonsense. The obligation of the citizen is to the republic and to the Constitution, not to the party. If the party serves the interests of the people, fine. It must be defended and promoted. If it does not, well, changes can be made. But it's the people out there. The people who are suffering. What are you going to do about them? Do you realize how many people are unemployed? Do you realize that most people who are unemployed who are over 50 have no chance of getting employment again? Do you realize what's happening to the healthcare system? What's happening to communities? Do you realize that states are now breaking down? Because states can't fund themselves. They can't auto-credit themselves. They depend on the federal government. The states are bankrupt. And they're about to disintegrate. They're already disintegrating. And you mean you're going to do something? You're going to wait until the Democratic Party gives you permission to speak? You're not a patriot, you're a fool. You're not a party loyalist, you're an encumbrance. And therefore, who cares? Whoever leads this nation back to safety will be able to assemble the political party that takes the victory, that leads it and wins it. Winning the war is generally good for popularity. That's what we have to do. So the first thing that has to be done now, all else aside, no obstacles, no ifs, ands, or buts. This is war, buddy. This is the existence of the nation, the existence of the republic. It's the existence of civilization. It's war, buddy. And you have no obligation to anything except the mission. The mission which is in the memory of people such as Eisenhower and MacArthur and many other people who in my generation did their duty. The time now is for people who are willing to stand forth and do their duty without fear of favor. Okay, so the first thing, what happens if we now proceed and inaugurate Glass-Steagall? Immediately, we put the banking system into reorganization. And all the junk banking, which we've been bailing out, will disappear. It'll disappear of its own weight, just be gone. What we can save are the banks in the form of a Glass-Steagall rule. They're going to be potentially bankrupt too. But under Glass-Steagall and under our Constitution, the federal government controls who goes bankrupt and who doesn't. Therefore, if we decide, we say we're going to defend these institutions, these banks, we're going to keep their doors open. We're going to supply them with a line of credit so they keep their doors open. So we will save the banking system, the commercial banking system of the United States, under federal protection, under a Roosevelt-style protection. Okay, now we've got a banking system. Now at the same time, we've wiped off the books the toy money, the play money, the monopoly money. All this bailout money disappears. Why? Because the institutions that claim it are bankrupt. You take away their power to get more bailout, more TARP. They're bankrupt. They're finished. Who cares? Wall Street? We don't need it. It's a disease. We don't need it. So we save our banking system. We'll save the banking system under federal law. Now, we have that obligation gone. We don't owe that money anymore. Now we create federal credit. What do we do with it? Well, there are two general things which are the benchmarks for what we have to do. Number one, we have to, of course, immediately have federal credit uttered by the federal government to the states to fund the restoration of the functioning of the states and the communities within them. Because the states cannot in themselves bail themselves out. You cannot allow the firemen and the police, the so forth, the whole schools, the whole thing, to disintegrate. You cannot allow that. So the federal government must supply the immediate credit necessary to keep the states functioning as sovereign as states, not as federal government, but as states. We must maintain their functions. Fine. That's the emergency thing that must happen immediately. So Glass-Steagall will let us do that. So that Congress stays in session. They don't need to go to an election because they're going to get plastered in this election anyway if they stay there. They go home. Huh? And they're not going to be popular at home. The best place is a place of safety where we can protect these congressmen in Washington. We can protect them here. I don't know what's going to happen to them in their regions, the way things are going. They're not very popular, you know. I don't know why they want to go home. A guy wants to be home to get lynched. I mean, this guy's not a very intelligent politician, not a good legislator. So we will stay in session. We don't need that campaign. We need to save the nation, not an election campaign. We don't need to save the Democratic Party. Keep it in Washington. That's the only way to save it. And keep it voting up Glass-Steagall. They can do it. Vote up Glass-Steagall. That means that now they can have federal legislation immediately forced through. Oh, in the meantime, by the way, there's good news. Obama will quit. You don't have to throw him out. He'll quit. His administration is already disintegrating. His government, the Obama section of the federal government in Washington, is disintegrating as we speak. They're running to the woods. and they're afraid of the bears will get them. No, so that's what we do. First, that. All right. Now we have to have a recovery program. First of all, you have to have a stability program. Protect the people. Protect the states. Protect our Constitution. Now we need a recovery program. We already have one. A little problem there, we got to get the Canadians to cooperate with this and the Mexicans, but that's not the big problem. Because the Canadians, faced with the situation they're going to face, will do it. Not because they want to do it or because the British Empire wants them to do it, but they'll do it because their butt depends upon it. They're going to have a butt still, they're going to have to protect it by doing this. What are we going to do? We're going to make one of the greatest economic surge of recovery the world has ever seen. And is based on a plan which is largely already designed and has been designed since 1964. It's called NWAPA. This program, which is necessary, will be the greatest improvement in life on this planet which has ever been possible. It will be, the first 20 years will be great. It's a major project, NWAPA. And this project will guarantee us the rapid employment of 3 to 4 billion people, many of whom are presently unemployed, but have high-quality skills, who will be employed in this project. Now, the project not only involves the NWAPA project itself, but you have to implement NWAPA, what do you have to do? Now, NWAPA is a project which deals with this area largely between the 20-inch rainfall line and the mountain ranges along the coast, Pacific coast, up into the Arctic, and leads into, of course, a tunnel or a bridge between Alaska and Siberia, which means an opening up of the world. It also means a model for what we can do in Africa, to bail out Africa, to save it from hell. What this will do will essentially require that, in addition to changing the weather, the climate, this NWAPA will change the climate. Every drop of water that goes into NWAPA will actually be multiplied in benefit by that drop of water will be recycled through on the west to east line, will be recycled as the form of rainfall. That is, when the moisture that is comes out of up from the earth goes into cloud formations. The cloud formations are rain formations. And therefore, in a case like this, the amount of net water that from NWAPA that we put into the system will give us 2.7 times that amount of rainfall across the territory of the United States. It means that. It also means that what we have to do to build the NWAPA. Now, you notice that the state of Michigan, the state of Ohio, most of Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and west to St. Louis is pretty much broken down nowadays. They're one of the gifts of Obama and his immediate predecessors. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to have to put all this concrete. We're going to build dams and water systems beyond your imagination. The Hoover Dam is a small pygmy compared to what we're going to be doing. But it's going to take 3 to 4 million people employed in this overall project, and beginning very early to do this. We're going to have to go to the people who were fired or laid off or whatever in Michigan, in Western Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, so forth. Because we need to have them rebuild the rail system. Where we have one-track systems, we need 2. Remember, we're going to be hauling more massive weight in terms of concrete and steel and so forth from the east coast of the United States to the western shore than has ever been conceived before. So not only does Nawapa represent a quick, immediate mass employment of skilled people while they're still alive to do it, and people who are now 50 years or older under Obama are condemned to death, the way it stands now. These people represent skills, which are high-degree skills, high-technology skills, or people who are associated with work of that type. We put these people back to work immediately. It takes a little friction to do it, but we can get it done. Now we're going to need to haul the materials which is going to be required for the installation of the Nawapa project. We're going to have to rebuild the railway system, redesign it for that purpose. We have an area, the agricultural area, west of the Mississippi, and particularly the 20-inch rainfall area, which is now disintegrated. The land is subsiding. The aquifers we're draining down are being emptied. The agricultural supplies of the United States are being destroyed by this lack of water. We've been going deep, picking up fossil water, bringing it to the surface for our agricultural system. We're going to have to get sensible again. We're going to have to rebuild the system. We're going to have to take, we're going to double-track railway systems with a single track, where they're built for lightweight, high weight. We're going to go high. Where we use only rail systems in steep areas, you don't want to use rails. You want magnetic levitation. Because if you want to go uphill, an incline uphill, and we're going up from the level above sea level to 3,000 feet and 5,000 feet. To haul this amount of concrete and steel and so forth up to that level, you're not going to want a rail, a push-me, pull-me rail system. You're going to want a magnetic levitation system to handle that kind of problem. Where is this going to be built? Well, it's going to be built in places where the air service and automobiles used to be built by the same kind of people that did that. That's what we did. That's what we did in World War II. Where do you think we got the auto industry from? We got it because Ford and General Motors and so forth began to build airplanes and everything else you could imagine. You'd have all these sites around the country which used to be fully employed, and they produced every damn thing you can imagine for the war. And we converted that later largely to automobile production. Put that back to work. Get our people back to work. Now, not only do we have that, but we have a country like Russia, which is in terrible condition. But it has some of the most essential mineral resources in the world for the world needs of this type. It also is essential in its capability, for nations like Mongolia, China. It is the key market for Japan, for South Korea. It's essential for India and countries of the southern rim of Asia. We can, with the same thing, by extending the rail systems in this way, or the magnetic levitation systems, we already have a design for a project for a whole chunk of Africa under which rail systems and similar kinds of systems are carrying bulk and development. We can take this Congo project, we put this up on our website. We take the excess Congo water, which just goes right to the Atlantic Ocean, doesn't do any good for the country. We put it across a mountain range, and we put it down in the direction of Lake Chad. And Lake Chad grows again. And by these kinds of systems, we have the only effective approach for solving the chronic problems of Africa in terms of the people of Africa. We can do that. We can go through the Darien Gap. We can get a communication system from Central America into South America through closing the problem of the Darien Gap, which means a revolution in terms of the productive powers of South America. So therefore, what we're talking about in Nawapa is a keystone. It's a keystone for the development of Eurasia. It's a keystone for the rescue of Africa from hell. It's a keystone for South America. The greatest project that mankind has ever undertaken on this planet is an economic project. Now stands before us as the opportunity which can be set into motion by the United States now launching the NOAPA project with the preliminary step of reorganizing the banking system to Glass-Steagall and then moving on from there. Now, there's several things that has to be understood about this. This is a great project. We've got a team working on this. The team is competent. We're tapping into people who are competent to augment what we intend to do, make it possible. But there are some problems. Some of them are conceptual problems. Now, the way most people think about infrastructure is not competent. They don't know what infrastructure is. The economists are generally kind of stupid, especially these days. The economists used to be intelligent when we gave them challenges which they didn't know how to solve. And people would work on these challenges and solve these problems and get a little smarter as a result of that. But if you give them dumb jobs, they tend to become dumb people. So by challenging people to grow up and become smarter, as the challenge of opportunity, you find they do wonderful things. Human beings are very good things to have. But you have to treat them properly in order to get that benefit. It's like, the ant has to treat the aphid kindly or if it wants that sugar. So the idea of infrastructure is kind of stupid. And I'm going to do only a few things today on this kind of thing, but I think some explanation is required on this occasion before we get into discussion. The problem here is that we think in terms of infrastructure as an also-ran. That's how we define infrastructure. We don't understand how to develop an economy. The way humanity has functioned, let me take it back to ancient history to modern history. Our first knowledge, actual knowledge to some degree, of what actually happened, occurred during ancient times. Especially became clear to us from what we know from the time that the great glacial development began to melt, about 17,000 BC. At that time, the levels of the oceans of the earth were about 400 feet lower than they are today. Why? Because all these ice cubes were piled upon this area, these other areas. Europe was largely uninhabitable and so forth. We had a great sheet of ice halfway down to midway down in the North America and so forth. So over this period up until about 2000 AD, you had this glacial process melted. And the seas rose up to about 400 feet in level, sea level, above what they were before and what they are today. But in this period, technology was located in what? It was located in transoceanic migration. And contrary to some fairy stories, we developed a population. It wasn't a very large world population by present standards, but it was a maritime culture. So the superior cultures that predetermined everything we know about human progress since were essentially maritime cultures of ocean-going peoples who had discovered that the star system was not a speckled thing up there, but was a closed system with a certain regularity and a certain kind of regularity, and that you would have to know this regularity in order to navigate across oceanic distances to get to your destination, because you had only the star map to define your arrival at your determined destination. And so therefore, these people were the most advanced people of that time, were the oceanic people who do transoceanic navigation. And they became a dominant factor, and particularly in the case of the emergence of European civilization out of Mediterranean civilization. There were also Indian Ocean developments of that type. There were also transoceanic, transatlantic developments. There was, Christopher Columbus did not exactly originate that first trip he took. Actually, they'd been moving back and forth across the same route by about the same methods of motion as Columbus did. For example, between what is now called Mexico and what is called the Mediterranean, This was a very common thing, relatively speaking, back in those days. They knew how to do it, and they did it frequently. You find things in Mexico which will attest to that. There's things you see as evidence of that kind of culture. Also, as trans-Pacific cultures. Whole parts of the population of Central America came from China, and with the result of trans-Pacific migrations, which are rather famous. So you had then the idea of science as we know it, or we can trace as science, and it means technology also, comes from largely from these transoceanic cultures, which learned how to do this. So this transoceanic culture represented a platform of the most advanced stages of civilization in those periods. Then you had a fellow called Charlemagne, who in the medieval period made another great step. He not only observed, developed the fact that you could go up large rivers into the interior of Europe, but he also developed a system, an organized system, of connecting these rivers with canals. And thus, by managing the water systems internal to Europe, he expanded the potentiality of human existence. Now, Charlemagne, when he died, terrible things were done to that area. But the precedent existed. For example, you have in the United States, when we developed the United States, the Americas first, we started by water systems, canals, and similar kinds of riparian systems, as well as transatlantic systems. Then later, when we developed the transcontinental railway system by steps, our initial lines would follow the same lines as the canal system. The New York Central Railway was on that basis. The Baltimore and Ohio, the same thing, so forth. So therefore, we went a step upward from progress in humanity to railway systems. They reached an apex in the course of the aftermath of the Civil War of the United States, where we developed transcontinental railway systems, which increased the productive powers of labor of nations. That was extended in Europe. And the British got upset because they feared that the copy of the American accomplishments into the period of 1876 would spread in Europe and Eurasia, which would mean the British Empire would no longer have a maritime control over the planet. And that's why the British organized World War I, for that reason. Now we have another step of progress, not only the increase of power through various forms of combustion and increasing the level of temperature of production. We now are at the verge of what? Of nuclear power, which is a whole order of magnitude higher. We are now going to, again, to thermonuclear fusion. It's a still higher level, which means that we conquer not only distance more effectively, we also are able to process raw materials in ways which were impossible earlier. We're now headed towards space exploration, which is not merely trying to find a place to live, a cottage in Mars or something. But the point is that by developing man's power to solve these kinds of problems, problems of habitation, problems of life, we are increasing man's ability to exist. We're increasing man's ability to function. We're improving the mental conditions of life, of humanity. We're building a better society. And that's what this project represents. Because by developing NWAPA, which solves a major problem for Canada. I mean, Canada cannot survive without NWAPA. They may think they can, but they can't. Mexico cannot survive without help of NWAPA from northern Mexico. Russia cannot make it without cooperation with the United States and other countries in developing these areas of raw materials and transportation, which are necessary for the people of China, for the people of India, and so forth and so on. So Russia's great mission is its specific scientific capabilities, which are built into some of the institutions there, which know how to do this sort of thing. And so therefore, that's what we're doing. We have a global perspective of combining systems of sovereign nation states, which means language cultures, to develop the minds of the people in the various nations, in the various language cultures, and to use the language cultures and poetry and so forth as a vehicle for creating the powers of imagination of human beings, bringing them to higher levels by going to missions which are more challenging than missions before. And this is the secret of economy. So what we are doing then, if we go with this, with a new economy conception, we're doing that. Now, what does it mean? We have to think in terms of platforms. I use the example of transatlantic and similar kinds of long-term maritime culture. That's a platform. It's a step up for all mankind to go to maritime culture against local culture, which is stagnant. For example, the Berbers that lived there long before the collapse of the Ice Age. The Berbers exist there today. The sea people who came in there dominated them for a while, and they're still there. The Berbers are there. So the ancient cultures of the world, in many cases, have survived, or have a trace of their survival. But what's happened is that the movement of humanity as a whole has been the rise in the level of culture, of productive culture, which is not just getting more, being more productive in physical terms. It's raising the level of mankind intellectually, morally, to higher goals. And what was before us is the challenge of the terrible challenge represented by this catastrophe called President Obama. Forces us to think in terms of going upward. And NWAPA is a step upward. Once you get into NWAPA and begin to operate on this scale, now you realize that we'll be able to influence the part of the solar system which affects us. We gain control, more control over the conditions of human life on this planet. Because now we're able to actually act upon the protective layer, like the ozone layer, which makes human life on Earth possible. We are then able to extend that kind of thing into other things, other ways, and makes those things possible. So we have to think in terms of platforms of culture, platforms of productive culture, from relatively lower levels to successively higher levels, which increases not only the physical opportunity for human life, but also increases mankind, improves the quality of mankind himself. And our mission should be to improve the quality of mankind, not only so that we can deal with potential catastrophes, but just because it's a good thing to do. It's naturally human as opposed to bestial. So that's our option right now. We face a time where Russia is moving in a direction of trying to find a way to cooperate in this kind of process. China has no hope unless there's a long-term plan for this planet so that China can solve the problem of bringing the conditions of life of the average Chinese up to an acceptable level. India has the same thing, same problem. A large percentage of the population is in dire straits with no hope whatsoever. We have to raise the level of existence of the human being on this planet. We have to do it in terms of language cultures, and therefore cooperation among language cultures for common ends is essential, is our destiny. We don't need a globalization. As a matter of fact, we abhor it, if we're sane. We respect the culture of every people as something which they should develop because it is them. It is their ability to think. It's their communication. It's their social relations. But we must have cooperation among cultures. And cooperation in cultures means developing these plateaus of successively higher platforms. And we organize production on the basis of these higher platforms. And that's what we must do. We must have that kind of policy. There is an impulse for cooperation among nations within Russia, such as Russia, within China, within India, and within other countries, a desire for progress in terms of what we might call the equivalent of national cultures, which may differ in culture, but have a right to access to the same level of platform of technology, scientific technology, as every other nation. And the bringing humanity together with the idea of these platforms, but based on national sovereignty, is a way not of trying to control strife on the planet, but to build peace in a positive way, to build cooperation in a positive way, where everybody who makes a contribution in whatever language to human knowledge in this direction is expressing a common interest of mankind. We have to have, if the time has come for mankind to grow up, to come out of childhood, or worse than that, infantilism, which is what we seem to be achieving lately. And that's the mission before us. And it begins with getting Obama out. How do you get Obama out? Get Glass-Steagall in. He goes out automatically with a flushing sound. And once that happens, and we take this step, and we accept our challenge, and we convince the Canadians that they've got to be part of this, otherwise they're not going to make it anyway. And we go ahead with this project, the NWAPA project. And we already know from what we know in physical science and projects in science that we can back up the benefits of a NWAPA project in North America with scientific breakthroughs upward in terms of space science and things like that. Things that will be beneficial to mankind on Earth, because the more things we can deal with in the solar system and beyond, the more power we have for mankind to exist on Earth. And that's a good thing. And we can do that. So that's the project before us. And the time has come when we need people who are like people who lived in my generation, back during the 1930s and World War II period, who had, until Roosevelt died, had the kind of optimism built into them from the experience of conquering the threats of the 1930s and early 1940s to build the nation. And the British Empire moved at that point to exploit corruptions and weaknesses among us so that we destroyed what had been the greatest opportunity for mankind ever given in part, especially by Franklin Roosevelt. I represent that generation, the Roosevelt administration's generation. I've been a fighter in this thing for a long time. I've been associated in great projects like the SDI and some other things. I know what to do. Unfortunately, many younger people who are leading politicians today do not. I have to speak for them as the grandfather who tells the grandchildren to grow up. Thank you.